Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. Yesterday afternoon, my son sat in a parked car outside a facility in Kansas City for 55 minutes. He was supposed to be inside. There was a thing he was meant to be at. He did not go in. He sat in a car with the engine off in August heat and listened to his wife say something she has never said out loud in 20 years. And then he called me. You have probably seen the story by now. On Monday, yesterday, something called the Icon Sessions came out, a 20-year retrospective, recorded on the 18th of August in front of a small room, released 6 days later. Taylor performed, first time since the wedding, 3 songs, acoustic, stripped down to almost nothing. And she sat down and talked for a while, and somewhere in the middle of it she said a sentence that has gone around the world in about 18 hours. She said she felt washed up at 22. It has been covered as a nice piece of color. Isn't that remarkable? The biggest star on earth thought she was finished at 22. Look how wrong she was. What a lovely thing for young women to hear. All of that is true, and all of it is the small version. Nobody has asked the question that has been sitting in my chest since about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Who else was listening? My son is 36 years old. He has just finished his 14th training camp. He has a left knee that has not been entirely right since September of 2023. He is coming off a season in which his team went 6-11, which is the worst year of his professional life. And he has been carrying something all summer that he has not said to one single human being. He said it to me yesterday at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, in a car, in a parking lot, on the telephone, and he could not get through the sentence the first time. I am going to tell you what it was. And I am going to tell you what he did about 40 minutes after we hung up, which involved a pen and a piece of paper and a locker, and which he does not know I know about, because I did not find out from him. I found out from somebody else in that building this morning. And there is one more thing which I only found out at 4 o'clock this afternoon, about 2 hours before I sat down to record this. Somebody knocked on the window of that car. A woman he has said good morning to for 12 years, and whose name he did not know until this morning. She stood next to a parked car in August heat and said 9 words to my son that I have not been able to put down all day, and then she tapped the roof twice and walked off. I called her this afternoon. Her husband died in 2019. That is at the end. I am telling you it is coming, so you stay for it, because I think it is the most useful thing in this video, and it has nothing to do with anybody famous. Part 1. The line. Let me give you the actual line, because the headline version has flattened it. She was talking about writing a song called Nothing New. If you do not know it, and most people do not, it is not a hit. It is not on any radio. It came out in 2021 on a re-recorded album as a track that had been sitting in a drawer since about 2012. It is a song about being 22 and watching younger people arrive and understanding that the thing everybody liked about you was that you were new. And she said, and this is her, not me, this is on the recording. She said it sounds ridiculous, but at 22 years old, she felt completely washed up. And then she said the part that did it. She said, I felt like maybe the only thing that made me special was that I was this, teen phenom, whatever I was looked at as. The only thing that made me special. Part 2. Where he was. He was not at home. He was at the facility in Kansas City. It was Monday, and the roster is being cut to 53 on the 30th, and it is a busy week, and there was somewhere he was meant to be. He got to the parking lot at about 3:10, and somebody had sent him a link. I asked him who, and he said, I don't know. Somebody. It's been going round. He said, about 9 people sent it to me. He said he sat in the car to watch the performance. That is what he intended to do. Watch 3 songs. His wife's first performance since their wedding, which he had not been able to be at because she recorded it on the 18th of August, which was the last week of training camp. He said, I wanted to see her sing. He said, I hadn't seen her sing since, Mom, I hadn't seen her sing since the wedding. He watched the 3 songs, and then he did not turn it off. Part 3. The 3 songs. I want to say something about what she chose, because I have listened to it 4 times now, and I do not think it was random. She sang 3 songs, and she ran them together. I knew it, I knew you. August, all too well. I am not a music person. I want to be clear about that. I am 73 years old, and I know about 4 Taylor Swift songs properly, and 2 of them are because my son plays them in a car. But I know what August is. Everybody knows what August is. It is a song about a summer that somebody did not get to keep. It is about something that was slipping the whole time you had it. She recorded that performance on the 18th of August. On the 18th of August, my son was in a dormitory at Missouri Western State University in St. Joseph, Missouri, in the last week of the 14th training camp of his life. They had been apart for most of the month. I asked her about it on the phone this morning. I said, Why August? And Taylor Swift said, Because it was August. And I said, That's not an answer. And she said, Donna, it's the whole answer. She said, I have not seen my husband for most of this month. She said, he was in a dormitory in Missouri, and I was where I was, and the whole thing went past. She said, and there is a song about exactly that, which I wrote in 2020, about something completely different, and it turns out that is what songs are for. Part 3.5, the dress. I have to say something about the dress, because about 4 million people spent yesterday analyzing it, and they are, as far as I can tell, all correct and all missing something. She wore a seafoam green dress with cascading ruffles and 3 rosettes pinned at the shoulder. And within about 90 minutes, the internet had decided it was a signal. The color, the shape, the general softness of it. It looked, people said, like the debut album era, 20 years ago, the 16-year-old with the curly hair and the guitar. Which means, people said, that the re-recorded version of that first album is coming. They are probably right. I have no idea. I am 73 years old, and I could not tell you the difference between one of that woman's records and another one with a gun to my head, and she knows it, and she finds it restful. But here is what nobody said. I called her about it this morning, mostly to be nosy. I said, Everybody's talking about your dress. And she said, I know. And I said, Was it a signal? And Taylor Swift said, Not the one they think. She said, The room was songwriters. I said, What? And she said, It was the Recording Academy's songwriters wing. That room was full of people who write for a living, and mostly do not get looked at. She said, Some of those people have written songs you have known your entire life and could not pick out of a queue at an airport. She said, And when you go into a room like that, you have got a decision to make, which is how much of the machine you bring with you. She said, I have been to rooms like that, where somebody arrives with the full apparatus and it changes the temperature and everybody sits up straighter and it stops being a conversation. I said, So the dress was, and she said, The dress was, I am not doing that today. She said, It is a dress from a brand that a great many normal women own. It is not couture. It is not a statement. You could buy it. She said, I did not want anybody in that room to feel that a different kind of person had walked in. I sat with that for a second. And then I said, And the 3 rosettes? And she said, 3, because 2 looked wrong and 4 looked mad. And I said, That's it? And Taylor Swift said, Donna, sometimes it's 3 because 2 looked wrong. I want to include that because I think it is the single funniest thing anybody has said to me this year, and because there are people who spent yesterday afternoon constructing entire theories about 3 rosettes. But I want to add one thing that she did not say and that I noticed on the third watch. The camera goes wide once, near the beginning, and you can see the room. And there are about 40 people in it. 40, in an industry event, for a woman who fills stadiums. Her first performance since her wedding, the thing every outlet on this earth would have carried, happened in front of about 40 songwriters in a room with the lights up. She sang 3 songs to 40 people who write for a living. And then it sat in a drawer for 6 days and came out on a Monday. Part 3 3/4. What the 3 songs did. I have watched the performance 4 times now, and I want to describe one thing, because it is the part my son mentioned first, and nobody has written about it. She ran them together. 3 songs, no gap. She did not stop between them. She did not say anything between them. She started one, and it became the next one, and it became the next one. About 11 minutes, unbroken. And here is the thing. She did not look up. 40 people in a room, lights up, cameras somewhere. And for 11 minutes she looked at a guitar. Not once. Not at the end of a song, not between them, not at the last note. 11 minutes of a woman looking down at her own hands. I said to her this morning, "You never looked up." And there was a pause. And Taylor Swift said, "No." I said, "Was that on purpose?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Taylor." And she said, "It wasn't on purpose." I noticed afterward. She said, "I watched it back on Monday night before it went out and I thought, oh, I did not look at anybody for 11 minutes. I said, "Why do you think that was?" And she said, "Because it was the first time since the wedding." She said, "I have played in front of 90,000 people about 400 times." She said, "And I sat down in a room with 40 songwriters in it, 7 weeks after getting married, and I could not look at any of them." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because they'd have been looking at a married woman." She said, "I have been a great many things in front of an audience. I have been a teenager, and I have been a phenomenon, and I have been a villain for about 2 years, and I have been whatever I have been since." She said, "I have never been somebody's wife in front of anybody." She said, "And I did not know what my face was going to do about it, so I looked at the guitar." I want to put that next to something. The middle song was August. She looked at a guitar for 11 minutes in a room of 40 people in the 3rd week of August, and the song in the middle was about a summer somebody did not get to keep, and her husband was in a dormitory in Missouri, and she recorded it 6 days before he sat in a parked car and heard it. Part 4. What he did not turn off. So he watched 3 songs. And then the interview started, and he did not turn it off, and he sat in a parked car in Kansas City in August heat for another 40 minutes. He told me, "I've never heard her talk about that period." I said, "What period?" And he said, "The early one, 19, 20, 21, 22. He said, "I've heard her talk about everything else. She talks about 2016. She talks about the Masters. She talks about the last 10 years constantly." He said, "She does not talk about being 22. He said, and she sat there and said she thought she was finished. He said, "At 22. Then he said, "Mom, I've done the arithmetic. That's 2012. That's the year Red came out." He said, "She was about to make 5 of the biggest records anybody has ever made, and she thought she was done." And then he was quiet for a bit. And then he said the thing. Part 5. What he said. He said, "I've been thinking that since about February." I did not say anything. He said, "I want to say it out loud once, because I've been carrying it since the season ended, and I have not said it to anybody, and I am not going to say it to her." And I said, "Say it." And my son said, "I think the only thing that makes me interesting is that I catch a football." I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, with the phone against my ear. He said, "And I've got maybe 1 year left of that. Maybe." Maybe none. Maybe I go out there in September, and it's gone, and everybody finds out at the same time. He said, and then what am I? He said, I'm a guy who was good at something for 14 years. He said, and I'm married to somebody who's going to be doing what she does when she's 60, and 70, and 80, because she makes things, and you can make things forever. He said, I don't make anything. He said, I catch a football, and then one day I don't, and that's the whole thing. I said, Travis. And he said, don't. I said, I wasn't going to say anything. And he said, you were going to say I'm more than that. And I said, yes. And he said, I know I am. On paper, I know that. I've got a podcast and I've got things and I've got a whole, I know. Then he said, it doesn't get in. He said, it does not get in, Mom. I have been told that by everybody who loves me for about 2 years and it does not get in. And then he said, and then a woman on a screen said the exact same sentence about herself at 22, and it got in. Part 5.5. He went and found the song. There is a part of yesterday I did not know about until this morning. After we hung up, after the parking lot, after the sentence about catching a football, he did something. He went and found nothing new. He had never heard it. I want you to sit with that, because I did. My son has been with that woman for 3 years. He has been to her shows. He has heard her sing at his own wedding. He has, by his own account, listened to more of her catalog than he has listened to any other artist in his life, because he is a man who commits. He had never heard nothing new. It is not a hit. That is the reason. It came out in 2021 as a vault track, one of the songs that had been written and then not used, and then sat in a drawer for 9 years. It is a duet. It is quiet, and it is short, and it does not get played anywhere. Millions of people know it extremely well, and about 1 billion have never heard it. He told me this morning. He said, I went and put it on in the car after we hung up. I said, yesterday? And he said, yeah. I sat in the same parking spot. I said, how many times? And my son said, I don't want to say. And I said, Travis. And he said, 11. He listened to a 4-minute song 11 times in a car, in a parking lot in Kansas City, in August heat, with the engine off. That is about 45 minutes. I said, what's in it? And he said, Mom, it's a girl asking how a person can know everything at 18 and nothing at 22. He said, that's the line, that's the whole song. She wrote that when she was 22. Then he said, and I'm 36, and I've been asking myself the same thing about a football field since February. He said, and the other thing about it, and this is the part that got me on about the 6th time through. He said, she wrote it, and then she didn't use it. I said, what do you mean? And he said, it sat in a drawer for 9 years. She wrote the truest thing she was feeling at 22, and then she put it away and made a completely different record, and nobody knew. He said, for 9 years she walked around with that in a drawer. He said, and then she was 31, and she was fine, and she went and got it out and put it on a record, and by then it was history. I said, what does that tell you? And Travis Kelce said that you can put it away for a while. He said, you don't have to solve it. You can just write it down and put it in a drawer and go and do something else for 9 years and then come back and find out you were wrong. I did not say anything for a moment. And then I said, is that what the paper is? And there was a very long silence on that telephone. And he said, what paper? Part 5.75. I should not have said that. I made a mistake this morning. I want to be honest about it because I have made a number of them this year, and I have told all of them. Somebody called me at about 7 this morning and told me about the locker. 6 words on a piece of paper, taped inside. And at about 11 o'clock, I was on the phone with my son, and I was not thinking, and I said, "Is that what the paper is?" And there was a silence. And he said, "What paper?" And I said, "Nothing, I misspoke." And Travis said, "Mom." And I said, "I misspoke, Travis." And my son said, "Who called you?" I did not tell him, and I am not going to. And he did not push, which is the thing about him, and which somehow made it worse. He said, "Okay." And then, after a second, he said, "It's not a bad thing." And I said, "I didn't say it was." And he said, "I know you didn't. I'm telling you, it's not a bad thing." And then he said something that I have decided to believe. He said, "It's the opposite." He said, "I put it up there so I'd see it every day and remember that somebody said it about themselves and was completely wrong." I said, "So it's a reminder." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "That you're wrong." And Travis Kelce said that she was. He said, "I don't know about me yet." He said, "I'll find out in about 4 months." He said, "But I know for a fact she was wrong, because I've seen what she did after 22, and if the smartest person I've ever met can be that wrong about herself, then it's at least possible." He said, "That's the whole thing on the paper, Mom." He said, "It says it's at least possible." Part 5 and 5/8. The Woman Who Knocked on the Window. There is one more thing about that parking lot, and I did not find out about it until this afternoon, about 2 hours before I recorded this. Somebody knocked on the car window. He had been sitting there for a while by then, the engine off, the song on for the fourth or fifth time, and a woman knocked on the glass. I want to describe her the way he described her, because he was very precise about it in a way he usually is not. He said, she was about 60, maybe older. She had a lanyard. He said, she works there. Not in football. In the building. I don't know what she does, and I've seen her about 400 times, and I do not know her name, which I am not proud of. He said, and she knocked on the window and I put it down. And she said, "Are you all right?" He said, and I said what you say, which is, "Yeah, fine, thanks." And she looked at me. And then she said, "You've been out here an hour." He said, and I said something about a phone call. And she said, "Okay." And then she did not go away. He said, she just stood there. He said, she stood by the window with her hand on the roof of the car, and she did not say anything, and she did not leave. He said, for about 15 seconds. And then she said, "My husband did this." I want to give you the rest of it as he gave it to me, because he did it slowly, and got some of it wrong the first time and had to go back. She said her husband had worked somewhere for a very long time, 30-something years. She did not say where. And she said that at the end of it, in the last year, he used to sit in the car in the driveway. She said, he'd get home and he'd sit out there. 20 minutes, half an hour. And Travis said, "What did you do?" And she said, "Nothing. For about 8 months I did nothing, because I thought he wanted to be left alone." And then she said, "And then one night I went out and got in the passenger side." He said, and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Nothing happened. We sat in the car." She said, "We did that for about a year. Every night. 20 minutes in a parked car in our own driveway, and then we'd go in." He said, and I said, "Why?" And this woman said, "Because you can say things in a car." He said, she tapped the roof twice and said, "Go home," and walked off. He said, and I did not go home. I went inside because I had a thing. But he said, "I've thought about it about 9 times since." I said, "Do you know her name?" And my son said, "No." And I said, "Are you going to find out?" And Travis Kelce said, "I already did." He said, "I went and asked this morning." He would not tell me her name and I did not push. But he told me one thing. He said, her husband died in 2019. He said, so the year in the car was the last year. I did not say anything. And he said, Mom, she has been walking past me in a hallway for 12 years. He said, I have said good morning to that woman probably 1,000 times. He said, and yesterday she stood in a car park in August and told me about the last year of her husband's life because I looked like something she recognized. I said, what are you going to do? And he said, nothing. What would I do? She doesn't want anything. Then he said, I'm going to learn her name and use it. He said, that's it. That's the whole thing I can do. Part 5 3/4 again. What I think she saw. I have been thinking about that woman all day, and I want to say what I think happened, because I think it is the reason this story exists. She did not see Travis Kelce sitting in a car. She saw a man in his mid-30s sitting in a parked car with the engine off for an hour, which is a specific thing that she had watched somebody do for 8 months in a driveway before she understood what it was. And she did the thing that almost nobody does, which is that she went over. She had no reason to. She works in a building. He is somebody she says good morning to. There is a very large distance between those two facts and going over to a car. And she went over, and she asked if he was all right, and when he said yes, she did not accept it, and when he made an excuse, she stood there for 15 more seconds without saying anything. 15 seconds is a very long time to stand next to a car saying nothing. I have thought about my own version of that all afternoon. Because I have got a list of people I did not go over to. Everybody has. That is the thing about it. Everybody my age has a list of times they saw something in somebody and decided it was not their business and drove past. She got in the passenger side. 8 months late, by her own account, and she still got there, and they had a year of it. I called her. I want to say that plainly. I got the name out of somebody else in that building this afternoon, and I called a woman I have never met and told her who I was, and she was extremely polite about it. And I said, I want to thank you for going over to that car. And she said, oh, he was fine. And I said, he was not fine. And there was a pause. And this woman said, no, I know. I said, can I say one thing about you in a video? Nothing identifying. And she said, what would you say? And I said, that you got in the passenger side. And she said, you can say that? And then she said one more thing before she got off the phone, and I am going to end this section on it. She said, tell people it doesn't have to be a conversation. She said, that's what everybody gets wrong. They think they've got to go out there and say something. She said, you just have to be in the car. Part 6. Why that worked. I have thought about this for about 18 hours, and I want to say what I think happened, because I think it is the useful part of this whole video. Everybody in my son's life has been telling him he is more than football. I have told him. Ed has told him. Jason has told him. Taylor has certainly told him, in 100 ways, without ever making it a conversation. None of it worked. And then his wife, on a recording, talking about herself 14 years ago, said, I felt like maybe the only thing that made me special was that I was this teen phenom, and it went straight in. Here is why. Nobody was reassuring him. That is the entire mechanism, and I did not understand it until yesterday evening. When somebody tells you that you are more than the thing you are afraid of losing, you know exactly what they are doing. They are managing you. They love you, and they can see you are frightened, and they are attempting to solve it. And the part of you that is frightened receives it as, she can see I am frightened, which makes it worse. Taylor was not talking to him. She did not know he would be in a parking lot. She recorded that on the 18th of August, in front of a room of songwriters, and she was talking about a song from 2012. She was not reassuring anybody. She was describing a thing that happened to her. And a man in a car heard somebody say the exact sentence that lives in his chest, in the past tense, from somebody who turned out to be spectacularly wrong. Part 7. What I said. I did not say very much, and I want to be honest about that. I said, "Does she know you feel this way?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why not?" And Travis said, "Because she'd fix it." I said, "Would that be bad?" And he said, "Yes." He said she'd fix it, and she'd be good at it, and it would work for about 4 days, and then I'd know that the reason I felt better was that my wife had done a thing to me. He said, "I don't want to be a project." Then he said, "And also she'd feel bad." I said, "Why would she feel bad?" And my son said, "Because half of it is her." I said, "What?" And he said, "Come on, Mom." He said, "I'm a tight end who's had a good career, and I'm married to the biggest thing on the planet, and every time anybody writes about me now, it's got her name in the first line." He said, "Which is fine. I chose it. I'd choose it 1,000 more times." Then he said, "But there is a version of me that gets remembered as a guy who married somebody, and that version gets bigger every year that I don't play well." He said, "So the football has to be good." He said, "That's the whole thing. That's why the football has to be good this year." Part 8. The Piece of Paper. Now I have to tell you what I found out this morning, because it is the reason I decided to make this today instead of sitting on it. After that phone call, he went inside. He was about an hour late for whatever it was, and I gather nobody said anything, because he is 36 years old, and it is the week before cuts, and he has been at that facility since 2013. And at some point yesterday evening, before he left, he wrote something down. I am not going to say who told me. Somebody in that building. Somebody who has known this family for a long time, and who called me this morning because they thought I should know, and because they were not sure whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. He wrote one line on a piece of paper, and he taped it inside his locker. The line is, "The only thing that made me special." That is it. Nothing else. Not the whole sentence, not her name, not a date. 6 words, on a piece of paper, taped inside a locker in Kansas City. The person who called me this morning said, "I don't know what it means." And I said, "I do." And they said, "Is it a bad thing?" And I have been sitting here for about 4 hours trying to answer that question. Part 9. 2 ways to read it. There are 2 ways to read 6 words taped inside a locker, and I do not know which one it is. The first way is that it is a warning. It says, "This is the trap. This is the sentence that a 22-year-old told herself, and she was wrong, and I am 36 and I am telling myself the same thing, and I am probably wrong too." If that is what it is, then it is one of the healthiest things my son has ever done. The second way is that it is fuel. It says, "The only thing that makes me special is this, so I had better be extraordinary at it. And I have got maybe 1 year, so it has to be now." And if that is what it is, then a man who is 36 years old, with a knee, is going to run himself into the ground between now and January. I have thought about it all day, and I genuinely do not know. And I do not think he knows either. Part 10. What she said this morning. I called her at about 8 o'clock this morning. I did not tell her about the locker. I want to be clear about that. I have not told her, and I am not going to, and if she is listening to this, she is finding out the same way you are, and I have thought about whether that is right, and I have decided it is. But I told her he had watched it. I said, "He sat in a car for nearly an hour," and she said, "Yesterday?" And I said, "Yesterday afternoon." And there was a pause, and she said, "Which part did he sit through?" I want to point at that question because it took me a second. She did not ask whether he liked it. She did not ask what he thought of the songs. She asked which part he sat through. I said, "All of it." And Taylor Swift said, "Oh." She said, I would not have said it if I'd known he was going to hear it. And I said, Taylor, it's a public recording. Of course he was going to hear it. And she said, I know. I know that. That's not what I mean. She said, I recorded that on the 18th of August. She said, I sat in a room full of songwriters, and I said a thing about being 22, because we were talking about a song I wrote when I was 22. She said, and the whole time I was in that room, I was not thinking about my husband at all. She said, and it came out yesterday, and by yesterday, everything was different. Part 11, The 6 Days. I want to say something about the gap, because I did not think about it until she said that, and now I cannot stop. She recorded it on the 18th of August. It was released on the 24th. 6 days. I asked her what she meant, and she said, Donna, a lot happened in that week. She would not go further and I did not push, because I know some of what happened in that week and it is not for this video. But she said one thing. She said, I said that sentence on the 18th as a thing from the past. She said, and it came out on the 24th, and I listened to it back on Monday night, and it did not sound like the past. I said, what did it sound like? And Taylor Swift said, it sounded like something I still think. Part 12. What she still thinks. She did not want to say it, and I made her, and I am not sure I should have. I said, do you still feel that way? And she said, no. And I said, Taylor. And she said, not in the way I did at 22. That was specific, and it was about being replaced by younger people, and it was, in retrospect, absurd. Then she said, it changed shape. She said, at 22, I thought the only thing that made me special was that I was new. She said, now I think the only thing that makes me special is that I make things. She said, which sounds much healthier, and it is the same sentence. I said, how is it the same? And she said, because there is still a condition on it. She said, it still says, the only thing. It still means that if I stopped making things, I would be nothing in particular. She said, I have got a house full of animals and a family I love, and a husband I would walk into traffic for, and if you asked me tomorrow what makes me worth anything, I would say the songs. Then she said, I have been like that since I was 14 years old, and I do not think it comes off. I did not say anything for a moment, and then I said, Taylor, my son said almost exactly that to me yesterday in a parking lot. And she said, about football? And I said, yes. And there was a silence on that phone that went on for a long time, and then she said, of course he did. Part 13. The thing neither of them knows. I have got two people who both privately believe that they are only worth the thing they produce. She has thought it since she was 14. He has thought it since, I would guess about 17, and I say that as somebody who watched a 17-year-old boy in Ohio work out that the football was going to be the way out. Neither of them has ever said it to the other one. They have been together for 3 years and married for 52 days, and neither of them knows that the other one is carrying the exact same sentence. And I am now the only person on this earth who knows both halves. Which is, I have to say, an extremely uncomfortable place to be sitting on a Tuesday. I said to her this morning, are you going to talk to him about it? And she said, about what? And I said, about the sentence. And Taylor said, I don't know how to start that conversation. And about 2 hours later, my son called me about something completely unrelated, and at the end of it I said, are you going to talk to her about it? And he said, about what? And I said, about the sentence. And Travis said, I don't know how to start that conversation. Word for word, 2 hours apart. Neither of them knows the other one said it. Part 13 and a half, I asked the other two. I did something last night that I have not done before, which is that I asked 2 other men in this family the same question. I asked Ed and I asked Jason, what is the thing that makes you worth anything? I asked it badly both times. Ed. He was in the garage. He is always in the garage. I said, Ed, I want to ask you something, and it's going to sound strange. And he said, Go on. And I said, What makes you worth anything? He did not answer for a long time. Long enough that I thought he had not heard me, which happens. And then he said, I don't have one. I said, What do you mean? And Ed Kelce said, I mean, I don't think about it. I have never thought about it. I said, Never? And he said, Donna, I'm 70-something years old. I get up, I do the day, I go to bed. He said, I don't run an account on myself. I said, How? And my husband said, What do you mean, how? And I said, How do you not? And he said, I've never seen the point. I want to say something about this because I stood in that garage feeling something quite complicated. Part of me thought, that is the healthiest thing I have ever heard a human being say. And part of me thought, that is because you have never been asked to justify existing. I said the second part out loud, which I probably should not have. I said, Ed, nobody's ever asked you to explain what you're for. And he put down what he was holding. And he said, 1989. I said, What? And Ed Kelce said, 1989, they asked me. He said, I stopped coaching, and there was about a year and a half where every single person I met asked me what I was doing now. He said, and I did not have an answer, and I had to say something to each of them. I said, I didn't know that bothered you. And he said, it didn't bother me. Then he said, I just stopped going places for a while. 46 years I have been married to that man, and last night in a garage I found out that he stopped leaving the house for a period in 1990, and I did not notice. Jason. I called him after, about 9 o'clock. I asked him the same question, and he answered it in about 2 seconds, which frightened me. He said, I'm the one who shows up. I said, that was fast. And Jason said, I've thought about it a lot. He said, I retired 2 years ago, Mom. That is the entire project of the last 2 years. He said, when I stopped playing, I had about 4 months where it was fine, and then about 8 months where it was not fine at all. I said, I didn't know that. And he said, nobody did. Kylie did. He said, and what I worked out, and it took the 8 months, is that the football was never the thing. The thing was that a lot of people needed me in a specific place, at a specific time, and I always went. He said, and I can still do that, it's just not a stadium anymore. He said, I go to things. I show up at people's stuff. I got on a plane to Missouri last Wednesday to watch a practice. He said, that's the job now. Turning up is the job. And then he said something I did not expect. He said, has Travis worked his out? And I said, no. And Jason Kelce said, yeah. He said, he won't until it stops. He said, you cannot work it out while you're still doing it. I couldn't. Nobody can. Then he said, he's got 4 months to a year, and then he's going to have the worst 8 months of his life, and then he'll be fine. I said, is that a promise? And my eldest son said, it's what happened to me. Part 13 3/4. And Kylie. I asked her this morning. I did not plan to. She called me about something else, and I asked her while she was mid-sentence about a car seat. I said, what makes you worth anything? And Kylie Kelce said, oh, we're doing this today, are we? She said, right, okay, give me a second. And she genuinely took one. I could hear a child somewhere. And then she said, it's not the kids. I said, it isn't? And she said, no, and I want to be careful about that, because it's going to sound bad. She said, I love those 4 more than I can construct a sentence about. But if you asked me what makes me worth anything, and the answer was, I have children, then I'd be in real trouble in about 15 years. She said, I've watched that happen to women, my whole life. Women whose entire account is their children, and then the children are 25. I said, "So what is it?" And she said, "I think I'm useful." I said, "Useful?" And Kylie said, "Yeah, that's the whole thing. I'm the person who does the thing that needs doing." She said, "In any room, if there's a thing that needs doing and nobody's doing it, I'll do it. That's it. That's my entire personality." Then she said, "Which is also a problem." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it means I'm only worth something when there's a mess." She said, "Put me in a room where everything is fine, and I don't know what I'm for either." She said, "Honestly, Donna, I think everybody's got one of these, and they're all broken in different ways." She said, "Travis has got I catch a football, Jason had I show up and had to rebuild it. Taylor's got I make things, you've got what did you say yours was?" And I said, "I hold the house together." And Kylie said, "Right." And mine is, "There's a mess and I fix it." She said, "And every single one of those is conditional. Every one of them stops working when the condition goes." I said, "Is there a version that isn't conditional?" And there was a pause. And Kylie Kelce said, "I don't know. I've never met anybody who had one." Then she said, "Except your husband, apparently, who I have just been told does not run an account on himself, which I think is either extremely enlightened or the most Ed Kelsey thing I have ever heard." I said, "Which do you think it is?" And she said, "Both. Obviously both." Part 14. My version. I am going to tell you mine, because I have not asked anybody in one of these to do something I have not done. I have got the sentence too. Mine is not football, and it is not songs. Mine is that for about 30 years I believed that the only thing that made me worth anything was that I could hold a house together. That is not a small thing, and I do not want anybody to hear me diminishing it. Running a household with 2 children and a husband, and a job on the money we had in Euclid, Ohio in the 1980s, was a genuine skill, and I was extremely good at it. But it was the whole account. If you had asked me in 1991 what I was for, I would have said, "I keep this going." And here is when I found out it was a problem. The boys left. Jason went to college in 2006, and Travis went in 2008, and by about 2009, there were 2 people in that house and nothing to hold together. And I did not know what I was for. I have never told anybody that. I have told the internet about 1974 and 1988 and 1989 this summer, and I have not told anybody about 2009 and 2010 because there is nothing dramatic in it. Nothing happened. I did not fall apart. I got up every day and went to work and made dinner and was completely fine. For about 2 years I was completely fine, and I did not know what I was for, and I did not mention it to anybody, including the man I was married to. I want to say what got me out of it, because it is relevant. It was not a realization. It was that in 2011 my mother got ill and needed somebody, and I went, and for about 14 months I had a job again. I want to be extremely clear about what I am saying. I got out of a 2-year hole because somebody I loved needed something from me. That is not a good system. I am not recommending it. It means my sense of my own worth was outsourced to whether anybody currently required me. But it is what happened, and I am 73, and I am not going to pretend I solved it some better way. Part 15. What I should have said. I said nothing useful to my son yesterday in that parking lot, and I have been annoyed about it for a day. So I am going to say it now, because he listens to these. You said the only thing that makes you interesting is that you catch a football. I have known you for 36 years, and I want to tell you the specific thing I think you are wrong about, and it is not the part you expect. You are not wrong that people love you for the football. A great many of them do, and that is fine, and it is what happens. You are wrong about the order. You think you got the people because of the football. Here is what I watched. I watched a boy who talked to absolutely everybody. In a shop, in a queue, in a parking lot, at 11 years old, before anybody knew who he was, and before there was any reason for anybody to be interested. I watched him get thrown off a football team at Cincinnati in 2010, and I watched who stayed. It was everybody. It was every single person. That entire team stayed, and half of them called the house. And you had no football at all that year. You did not get the people because of the football. You got the football, and you kept the people through it. Those are completely different facts, and you have got them backwards, and you have had them backwards since you were about 17. And to my daughter-in-law, who I know is also listening, because she listens to every one of these and then texts me about a comma. Taylor, you said the only thing that makes you special is that you make things. You said it to me on the telephone at 8 o'clock this morning, and you said it calmly, like a fact about the weather. Here is what I would like to put next to it. In the spring of 2025, you spent 6 weeks playing recordings of children at low volume in your own house so that a 15-year-old cat would not be frightened when 4 little girls came over. Nobody was watching. Nobody would ever have known. It did not go on a record, and it did not go on a chart, and there is no version of it that exists anywhere. You did it for a cat. I have thought about that all summer, and I did not understand until this morning why it stayed with me. It is the only thing I know about you that produced nothing. Part 15 and a half, last night. Something happened last night, and I have gone back and forth about whether to tell it, and I have decided to. At about 10 o'clock last night, my daughter-in-law called me. Second time in one day, which does not happen. She said, I did something. And I said, what did you do? And she said, I sent him the demo. I did not know what she meant, and I said so. And she said, of Nothing New, the original, from 2012. She said, it's a voice memo. It's about 90 seconds. It's me at 22, in a bedroom with a guitar, and it is genuinely terrible. I said, you sent it to him? And she said, at about 9. And I said, why? And Taylor Swift said, because you told me he sat in a car for an hour. She said, I have been thinking about that since 8 o'clock this morning, and I could not work out what to do with it, because he has not said anything to me about it, and if he has not said anything, then he does not want to talk about it. She said, so I did not want to ask him. She said, and then I thought, I do not have to ask him anything, I can just send him the thing. She said, so I found it. It took about 40 minutes because it is on an old drive, and I have not listened to it since about 2019. And she said, and I sent it with no message. I said, nothing at all? And she said, nothing. I said, what happened? And she said, he called me 9 minutes later. I said, and Taylor said, he didn't say anything about the song. She said, he called and I picked up, and he said, hey, and I said, hey, and he said, how was your day? She said, and we talked for about 40 minutes about absolutely nothing. She said, about his week and the cuts on the 30th and something about a rookie, about a book I've been reading, about whether we should get a dog, which is an ongoing thing. She said, he never mentioned it. I said, does that bother you? And Taylor Swift said, no. She said, that was the point. She said, I did not send it so he'd talk about it. I sent it so that when he is sitting somewhere in November, and it is going badly, and he is 36 years old with a bad knee, there is a 90-second voice memo on his phone of a 22-year-old in a bedroom being completely wrong about herself. She said, he does not have to say anything about it, he just has to have it. I said, Taylor, that is the single smartest thing I have ever heard anybody do in a marriage. And she said, it's not smart, it's a voice memo. And I said, it is extremely smart, and I have been married for 46 years, and I would never have thought of it. And then she said the thing that has stayed with me. She said, I have been trying to work out for 3 years how to tell that man something without telling him. She said, because you cannot tell Travis Kelce anything directly. If you say a nice thing about him to his face, he does the bit and it slides off. She said, he has got about 4 defenses, and they are all extremely charming, and none of them let anything in. She said, so you have to leave it somewhere. She said, you leave it in a room, and you walk out, and you do not mention it. I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland at 10 o'clock at night and thought about a note written 3 times and left on a pillow on the 4th of July. And I thought, they are doing the same thing to each other and neither of them has noticed. Part 16. For the people listening. I want to say something to the women my age, and I am going to be direct about it. You have got a sentence. Everybody has got one. It starts with the only thing that makes me, and it ends with whatever you have spent your life being good at. Mother, nurse, teacher, the one who organizes things, the one everybody calls. And at some point, and it is usually somewhere between 60 and 75, the thing stops. The children leave, the job ends, the person you were caring for dies, the house does not need holding together anymore because there is nobody in it. And you find out what you are for. Here is what I have learned at 73, and it took me from about 2009 until roughly last April. The sentence is a lie, and it is a lie that gets told to everybody, and it is particularly told to women. But you cannot argue your way out of it. I have tried. My son has had it argued at him by 4 people for 2 years, and it does not get in. There is only one thing I have ever seen work. You have to catch yourself doing something for nothing. And there is one other thing, which I did not have until about 4 o'clock this afternoon, and which came from a woman with a lanyard in a car park in Kansas City. If the person with the sentence is somebody else, if you are watching somebody you love sit in a car with the engine off, you do not have to say anything. You do not have to have a conversation. You do not have to find the right words, which is what stops almost everybody, because there are no right words and there never have been. Get in the passenger side. That is the entire instruction. A woman who is about my age watched her husband do it in a driveway for 8 months before she worked that out, and then they had 1 year of it, and then he died in 2019. She got there 8 months late, and she still says it was worth it. You are probably also late. Go anyway. Not a big thing, not charity, not volunteering, which is a job with a different name. Something with no product at all. Sitting with somebody, feeding a bird, playing recordings of children for 6 weeks so an old cat is not frightened. And then you have to notice that you did it, and that nobody knew, and that it counted. That is the whole method. It is extremely small, and it is the only thing I have got. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. Yesterday afternoon my son sat in a parked car in Kansas City and listened to his wife say that at 22 she thought the only thing that made her special was that she was new. He is 36, and he thinks the only thing that makes him special is that he catches a football. She is 36, and she thinks the only thing that makes her special is that she writes songs. Neither of them knows about the other one. There are 6 words taped inside a locker in Kansas City, and my son says they are a reminder that somebody was completely wrong about herself once, and I have decided to believe him. And there is a 90-second voice memo on a telephone in Kansas City of a 22-year-old in a bedroom in 2012 with a guitar, sent at 9 o'clock last night with no message attached, by a woman who has spent 3 years working out how to tell that man something without telling him. He has not mentioned it. He is not going to mention it. That is not the point of it. And somewhere in that building there is a woman with a lanyard who has been saying good morning to my son for 12 years, whose husband sat in a driveway for 8 months before she went out and got in the car with him, and who walked across a car park yesterday afternoon in August heat because a man in his 30s had the engine off for an hour, and she knew exactly what that was. He is going to learn her name this week. She is not going to think it was anything. 20 days until Denver. Thank you for sitting with me today.